Your children will be weird. That's a very good thing when the concept of normalcy has been defined by a whole set of indoctrinated values that aren't even yours in the first place.
You think about the way that life naturally unfolds, and then you say, well, we're going to take pretty artificial environment completely removed from the commercial world, from nature, off in a fence surrounded area, age segregated, every 50 minutes a bell rings.
In what ways am I different from everyone else? That actually allows me to create value for everyone else.
Welcome back to the OpenEd podcast. I wanted to do the weird episode. This is the episode about really the big question that everyone secretly has. That's honestly the number one objection to any kind of open education. Will my kids be weird? I don't want my kids to be weird. So I brought the two weirdest people I know. TK Coleman, who's co-host of the Minimalist podcast, author, speaker. I've worked with him for years, educator. He's coached hundreds of people of all ages, and he's a very, very interesting guy. And Ella Richmond, my colleague here, and also podcast host. And I want to dive into this question. So I didn't prepare you guys at all. So welcome to the weird episode.
Cheers.
So when I was just talking to Matt Bowman, founder of OpenEd. He's been on the podcast before, and he was telling me he was at lunch with a bunch of guys, and they all started talking. They found out he worked in education, and they all started talking about education. And he said every single one of them was complaining about their kid not having a good time in school for various reasons. One of them was just bored, wanted more flexibility. One of them was getting bad grades, but he's like, I know he's smart. I don't know why he's getting bad grades. One of them with just multiple reasons, but every one of them felt a pronounced discomfort with the status quo of the kind of just traditional schooling that they were doing. And he was like, well, why don't you pull them out? Why don't you open up their education, do a hybrid school, homeschool, micro school? And they all paused and were like, this is the classic thing. Like, can I do that? Like, what would happen? And he said the first thing, and this is always the first thing that they said was, yeah, but will they be okay? And he's like, what do you mean okay? Will they be weird? And they ask academic questions too. Will they be able to get into college? But really, I think the will they be weird, it really sums up all of the things you're worried about. Will they be too far off from what is seen as normal academically, socially, sports-wise, in every way? So I want to ask both of you, just open-ended to start with, and then I have some specific places we can maybe go. What is your response to the question? If I open up my kids' education, will they be weird?
I want TK to go first.
I say, yes, your children will be weird. And that's a very good thing when the concept of normalcy has been defined by a whole set of indoctrinated values that aren't even yours in the first place. The goal of life isn't to conform to whatever society defines in your generation as normal. There are lots of ways to define normal that are actually very dangerous and very unhealthy. And so I think every parent ought to be asking themselves the following question. In what ways do I want to help cultivate my child's weirdness? In what ways do I want my child to be weird? In fact, if you're a parent and you're thinking about these questions, look at your life right now and ask yourself, in what ways am I weird to my own benefit? In what ways am I different from everyone else? That actually allows me to create value for everyone else. And how do I want to pass that on to my children? So it's an important concern. I don't want to disparage it. It's a fair question, but I think sometimes we approach that question in a very one-sided way. So I'll lead with that.
Yeah, I love that point. Similar to what you were saying, weird it's not just not normal, it's not common, right? Not common is a very important thing because whenever you expand out into the question of what is your child supposed to be even, right? Your child is not supposed to be common. That's not how they were made. That's not what they were supposed to be. So implicitly, you want your child to not be common, similar to what you said. You want your child to be weird in some ways. So then the question is, what way? What way is the unique way that my child can be not common that actually suits them? So there's a weirdness that is not who they actually are. And maybe it is something that is nature versus nurture. It's something that came through their circumstances, right? Maybe they were not socialized. Maybe they had no friends. Like these like crazy weird case scenarios. But like on the other side, the not common that comes from nurture and nature, actually, sorry, nature, where it is the part of them that is just so unique, the part of them that is something inside of them that nobody can replicate. Like that's what I see, at least in the time that I've been doing open education and observing open education. The coolest thing is it's not just that families can create a cool environment for kids to learn better, it's that they get to find this spark, this genius, this uncommonality inside of this kid and then foster it. And it becomes even more uncommon. And then like all of the greats of history, they were uncommon in some way. That's why we notice them. That's why they stand out. Standing out is not common. That's the point. Would be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
I want to come back to that part in a minute, because there's a part of me as a, having 4 kids where you're like, yeah. We all know like Steve Jobs was a weirdo, whatever. My kids are probably not Steve Jobs. So like, I kind of just want them to not be below average. I want them to at least be normal, right? Like no worse than that. If they're super weird, they better be like a super genius or a super athlete. Otherwise, it's not helping their life. Being weird only helps if weird is channeled into good. So I want to put a pin in that component. But I want to ask you both a little bit on the personal side. TK, you did go to school. I think what gets left out when people say, will my kid be weird, is the counterfactual. Like compared to what? Like, is it not possible to be weird at school? I remember when I had homeschooled, and I always made fun of homeschoolers as a homeschooler, right? Like there's always the weird ones. And then I went to school and I was like, there's roughly the same percentage of weird ones at school, right? Like there's always people that are outliers. So I'm curious, TK, for you, do you think you are weird or were weird, right? As a kid, would your parents be like, I don't know, like he's a little weird, he's a little different. Like, and Ella, for you too, especially because you have siblings. I know you went to school, but if I'm correct, your youngest brother, he has more of an open education. And like, is he weirder than you and your other brother? So I don't care who goes first, but I'm curious from like your personal reflections from your own experience and kids around you. What was your relationship with like being the weird kid or seeing other weird kids given your school experiences?
I love the way you frame this, Isaac, because I think in fairness to the people who ask these questions, they are thinking about weirdness, not in terms of the eccentricities necessary for success, necessary to differentiate yourself. We all get it as a basic fact that you have to know how to differentiate yourself from the pack, no matter who you are. But what's really being asked here is, will my kid become a socially awkward, socially incompetent person who doesn't know how to navigate the diversities and complexions? None of us want to see our kid being the one around a bunch of other kids and they just don't know how to figure out how to get involved in that game of tag or how to get involved in that game of jump rope. And that can be a very concerning thing for parents. I'll say, even though there is a sense in which I'm weird in terms of the eccentricities of my interest and in my taste, weird in the sense of like, listening to jazz, at 18, 19, and when that's supposed to be like an old man activity. I can say when it comes to social life, the interesting thing, because of the approach my parents took with raising us, is that this is just one area where I've had the hardest time empathizing with struggle. And I've had to really dig deep to figure out why so many people have such a hard time making friends. It's that I usually don't put preconceived constraints on who my friends can be. And I don't think about my friends as people that have to be the same age in kind of like the same category as me. I just moved to a new place, and immediately within 2 weeks, there's some 80-year-old guy at my church that I'm just friends with, and I look forward to seeing him. And my social life is flourishing, and he introduces me to 5 other people. And then there's some guy at my church that's younger than me, and he's like my little brother, and we take walks together. And I'm just thriving in my social life. And then one day when I hear someone else complaining about their social life, I look at mine and I go, oh, I guess percentage-wise, the number of people who are my exact age and who are my peers or competitors, they may only be 20% of my friendship network, because my friends are all over the place and I never learned how to think about my friends in this way. And I would say that you never want your children to be the kind of people who only feel comfortable around their own age. And so when we place our children in these age-segregated environments and we teach them how to move through life where you're in sixth grade and you're always and only and mostly around sixth graders and then seventh graders and then eighth graders, by the time they get out of college, for most of these students, they have on average like a year or two of depression because they have to move somewhere where they don't know anybody and they no longer have the luxury of an artificial neighborhood, an artificial campus where everyone is your age and they've all taken on a vow of poverty. And you're in an environment where you're going to a job and there are people that are 5 years older than you, 15 years older than you. You've got a few people your age and you're not depressed. You're comfortable. You know exactly what to do because you see the basis for friendship as being something deeper or other than age. And so while I'm weird in terms of my tastes and interests, I feel like my social life, because of some of the alternative educational perspectives my parents have, has always been the easiest part of life.
So you hit on something that I really want to pause on for a second, because I wasn't thinking of this ahead of time, but you totally like solidified it as you were talking. Every kid, every human is going to struggle in life in various ways. And as a parent, often like, will my kid be weird is kind of a proxy for like, will they struggle? Will they like suffer? Will they feel left out? Will they feel bad? Will other people, even if they're unaware of it, other people look at them and think, like make fun of them in their head or whatever. And then as a parent, you don't want to see that. But I think that's not a great question if you don't add the when component. Like my kids are going to struggle in life. So the question is, when are they going to struggle? What is that going, the struggle sort of path going to look like? And I say that because kids who have an alternative approach to education, a much more open education where they're around people of different ages, et cetera, even if you grant, and this isn't always true, but let's just assume that it's true, that among a group of, let's just say, traditionally public schooled peers of their exact same age, they may behave differently than them. They may not act the exact same way. Different is not always bad, by the way. A lot go hang around a bunch of middle school girls. What's normal for them is like savage, brutal, rude, backstabbing behavior sometimes. Like it can be crazy. But so let's even grant that they don't quite fit in the easiest in that group, but maybe they are much more comfortable talking to adults of all ages, younger kids. They're more comfortable in all kinds of unusual situations, even if they're not as comfortable in a classroom setting with 30 other kids their age. So even if you take that as like, that's a struggle they'll face when they're 12, 13, whatever, something really interesting happens. By the time they're out of that very, very artificial environment of K through 12 schooling, where everybody is packed together at the same ages, and there's all these like weird social pressures and, popularity contests, you get into college and then you get beyond college. And the kids who are a little bit not as fitting into the cool crowd in K through 12 suddenly have an easier time than anybody because they already have a more developed sense of self apart from what is cool in the group. They already have an ability to navigate different situations. They can talk with the professor pretty easily. They can talk with the freshman and the senior. They can talk on their job with their boss who's 20 years older than them or an intern who's 5 years younger than them. They have interests, which like, it's so funny, this stark contrast, even between just high school and college. Someone in high school who's like, oh, they're the kid who's really into Fleetwood Mac. And it's like, well, nobody likes Fleetwood Mac, some weird folk band from the 70s. That's just the weird kid. You get to college, that is suddenly the coolest thing ever. You have a unique interest that is not just part of mainstream pop radio that's being fed to you. You developed this identity as somebody who likes something that's different than everyone else. Like that goes from a thing that makes you not cool to a thing that makes you cool almost overnight when you get out of high school. I've seen this with, go ahead.
What if we took that Fleetwood Mac phenomenon, right? And we unhooked it from, this is how the world changes for you when you go from high school to college. And we say, this is how the world has always been. And instead of forcing you to wait until college for you to experience yourself that way, we're going to facilitate experiences early on in life so that you can see whether it's Fleetwood Mac, Star Wars, or physics. You are already cool, and you just have to learn how to navigate the world in a way that helps you connect with people in a manner that makes it easier to see.
Absolutely. You think about the way that life naturally unfolds, and then you say, well, we're going to take this kind of pretty artificial environment completely removed from the commercial world, from the family world, from intergenerational stuff, from nature, cinder blocks off in a fence surrounded area. Every 50 minutes a bell rings. This is a very artificial environment. And you say, whatever the social pressure says you need to do there, we're going to call that normal. But as soon as that environment ends, you're back into the real world where those things don't apply anymore. And so, like, learning how to be normal in an environment that completely vanishes once you turn 18 and you'll never experience again is not really that helpful for the broader life. And you see this oftentimes. People that excel in that environment and kind of learn the social games, they often don't know where to point that and what to do later. And the opposite is true. I know for my oldest, he's just a really interesting philosophical guy, very imaginative ever since he was little. But like in the sort of various phases, he's like, yeah, the kind of normal stuff that normal kids his age do. He's always kind of like on the edges of it, not totally outside, but just sort of like, eh. And I always told him, like, someday that's going to make you more interesting than all those people. Starts hitting 17, 18, 19. Totally true. And he realizes and he gravitates to other people. He's like, all these people that like don't have anything else going. They just are a reflection of the average of the pop culture human of their age group. There's not much else there. They're not that interesting, right? Once you move out of that environment. So I just think it's worth considering to take a longer view than just like, will they be weird compared to other sixth graders? It matters. I don't want to dismiss it, but there's something bigger at play here. Who are they? Who are you trying to help them become for later in life? As a parent, your job is to get your kids to where once they are out there in the world, they can thrive independently, and worrying about how they thrive as a dependent is less important than what you're doing today that's going to help them thrive independently later. Okay,
Yeah.
Ella, I need to ask you about you and your experience and whether your younger brother who is more open educated is weirder than you who had a more traditional education.
So this actually fits in perfectly because this kind of makes everything that you were saying very concrete. So my experience was that I grew up in a very traditional education model. I went to private school for most of my life, and I opted into every single social game because I thought I needed to. And my goal was not to be unique or uncommon or weird. My goal was to be normal. Like I cared about doing well in school because my friends were doing well, but like my focus was not figuring out what I was interested in. It was not fostering any unique individuality inside of myself. It was making myself as unindividual as possible. What that led to was later I had that. Like I was great in the social realm and I could make friends and I knew how to play the games that everybody else played. But then I had to cultivate myself afterwards. And that was really hard. That was really difficult because nobody was there to help me. You grow up, you have teachers, you have people around you. You're in this environment where people are trying to facilitate learning. And that's the goal, right? The goal is that you can learn. You can ask your parents questions. You can ask your community questions. But I started doing that after I had left my community, after I had left my parents' house, after I didn't have this support system anymore. And so it was me by myself trying to figure out my own individuality. And then on the flip side, actually, my little brother, he has gone to an acting academy. He has developed his sense of self very deeply. And he wants to be an engineer. He's done a ton of things inside of that, built himself a workshop, reads tons of books. Like he has fostered that sense of who he is so deeply. But so he started that at about like 12, 13, 14. And then now he's getting to 17 and realizing that there are some things that he needs to cultivate more. So like sometimes he's really brash with people just because like he has ideas and other people don't understand them and he gets frustrated. But he's seeing how that does not help him socially. And so he has this foundation of his uniqueness, his individuality. On the flip side, now he gets to look at all the social expectations and societal things that most people learn young, like I did. And he gets to say, okay, what do I want? What is useful to me? And then he gets to opt into it and learn it. It's something that you can learn and just ask, why am I learning this? Why is this useful to me? And so I think his experience is actually stronger than mine. If I were to go back, I would rather his because I see a lot of my friends that don't get to ask, who am I anymore? Like sometimes you don't get the opportunity to do that. And it's really, really hard to do that after the fact. But if you get to do that when you're a kid, when everybody has this like belief that, you're growing and you're learning and you're creating, and like they're putting you in situations to learn. Like you have this opportunity and it's incredible. It is so much easier to learn social things. It's so much easier to learn like, okay, how am I going to be an awesome public speaker like after the fact? But
It's funny, TK, years ago, you told me about one of the best books I've read, Finite and Infinite Games. It reminds me of it's kind of a difference in starting point, Ella, that you're describing. The sort of traditional approach, you start with the assumption, and it's kind of implicit, nobody tells you this, but that you have to play all of the social games. And so you just start playing all of them. And then at some point in life, you're forced with the decision, which games do I actually care about playing? I'm going to need to choose. Some of the games are in conflict with each other. Which ones can I opt out of? And you have to develop that ability to pick and choose which games you're going to ignore and which ones you're going to play. Versus your brother, I don't have to play any games. And then when the games started coming, he could say, do I want to play that one? Yes or no? Versus like, I'm playing all of them as the default. And then eventually I have to drop some of them. I'm playing none of them as the default. And now I'm going to add the ones that I want to play.
And opting out once you've already opted in is so hard. So like some of my friends that have opted into certain games, like they'll never choose something that's different, that is odd, because that is uncommon, because it's really hard once you have, it's like the cognitive dissonance, and it's like you've made so many choices this way, like why would you stop? What is the stock market analogy? It's like whenever you put so much money in and then all of a sudden you have to take it out.
The sunk cost fallacy?
Yeah, the sunk cost fallacy, where it's like you've put so much into this game and now it's like, am I actually just going to throw it all away?
TK, you are one of the best people I know at charitable interpretation. So I want to take this question, will my kids be weird? And I want to hear like, give me the most charitable version of that. Like, what is the question beneath the question that is really a genuinely good question to ask and something to really be concerned about? A version of what someone means by weird that they should pay close attention to.
I know that as a parent, part of my job is to raise my children up to function independently of me someday. And I know how hard the world is. It's going to challenge them in all sorts of ways. And I want to know that my child is prepared for the world as they're actually going to experience it. And so it's nice to say things like teach them to follow their heart, teach them to embrace their weirdness. But there are some pretty normal, standard, universal realities we all have to deal with. And weirdness just doesn't seem to help those things. We all have jerks that we have to deal with. We all have bullies that we have to deal with. We all have to learn to stand up for ourselves. We all have to learn to walk into a room full of not weird people, but scared people who just want something delivered in the safest way possible. And I want my child to grow up to be prepared for those realities too. If I choose this path you're telling me about, am I going to abandon that?
Yeah. And I think that's really like two things can be true at once. When I hear that question, will my kid be weird? One is, as you guys have mentioned before, if we mean by weird, they don't conform to exactly what everybody else is doing, that's a good kind of weirdness. You want them to be able to think independently and to know who they are and to not just do whatever is popular and cave to peer pressure. And I think we don't examine enough to what extent we just sort of accept what lots of people do must be something that my kids should also do. Good to question that. But then the charitable version, like I want them to be able to navigate the world. And if they walk into a room and they ignore social cues and they whatever, I don't want them to suffer for that. I think like it's really important to remember your kid's disposition is actually really, really strong. It's a lot stronger than you think. They're not a lump of dough that's just purely shaped by their environment. So if you have a really social kid that loves being around people and picks up on all that stuff and becomes life of the party and popular, if you pull them out of school, they're still going to be that. They are, trust me, if you homeschool, you'll be like, oh, my kid's really social. Will I have enough social stuff? A year or two in, you'll be like, I think all my kid is doing is social stuff. Maybe homeschooling is too social and I need to have more like academic, because like they will find ways to find groups and sports. And kids, likewise, kids who are shy, just because you put them in school doesn't mean that they're not going to be shy. It might actually shove their shyness into a more intense version. So like they're going to bring that disposition with them. I think you just can't make the assumption that you can outsource that to school. Because you send them to school, school's not going to do that automatically any more than pulling them out of school is going to do that automatically. you have to be mindful of those things and those dispositions and try to help ensure that the right people, the right environments, the right resources are there to help rub off those rough edges or pull them out of their shell if they're shy, or help make sure that they're not too influenced by what's popular if they're social.
There is this aspect to that, though, where back to the charitable interpretation of the question, where people are asking, will this make my kids weird in a way that they are incapable of negotiating? Because as lovely as it is to talk about the power we have to negotiate possibilities and to be nonconformist in a positive way, there really are a whole lot of moments where you can only be valuable if you just know how to take an order or if you just know how to fit in. Sometimes, like you go get a job and, maybe I'm a teenager and I go get a job at a gas station or I go get a job at a Target and my opinion isn't needed. My creative ideas isn't needed. It's just my ability to wear the uniform that's prescribed for me, to put the boxes where I'm told to put them, to work the register in the exact way that everyone who has ever worked here for 20 years has worked the register. No new ideas. They just want you to follow the specifications that are laid out for you and do your job well. And to be able to be in that kind of space without looking at it as a tragedy or a great compromise on your personality or as like a punishment on your individuality, that can be a difficult thing. And I think parents are wanting to make sure that they aren't raising children who only know how to appreciate and embrace their weirdness. But then when they're in a position where the job is as simple as, can you take out the garbage and just get it done in less than 30 seconds? They're not like, well, I can't do that unless I can compose a song along the way.
Then you get some millennial kid who's like, I'm not sure if that sparks joy. I don't think no, this is interesting. Years ago, I wrote this article. I made a little 2x2 matrix, the obedience entitlement matrix. And high obedience, low obedience, high entitlement, low entitlement, and then you kind of get the combinations thereof. And I tried to like look at different generations. And I think that's kind of exactly what you're talking about, because you don't want someone who is just obedient all the time, no matter what. When someone tells me to do something, I do it, because that leads to sometimes atrocities, right? If somebody's horrible and abusive and telling you to do terrible things and you're just like, well, I just obey. No sense of entitlement and total obedience. Yeah, I don't deserve anything. I'll just do what you tell me to, right? Not good. But also if someone's totally entitled and totally disobedient, no, you can't tell me what to do. And I deserve really high pay and I can do whatever I want to on the job, right? Like that person's not going to work either. You have to have, and I think the combination of like ability to understand, like when you're in certain contexts, it's not that you're obeying or doing what someone says for its own sake, but your ability to understand, hey, in the context of this job, as a human being, I may be valuable inherently, but in the context of this job, I am only valuable to the extent I can create value better than the next person who could work for the same pay. And if they can find somebody for $15 an hour who will say yes to taking out the trash and I'll say no to it, I am no longer valuable to them. So obeying in that context is just a reflection of my relative value in this environment, not a reflection of who I am as a person. The fact that you asked me to take out the garbage does not need to offend my personhood and say, oh, that's all you think I'm good for? But that's what's valued in this context. You need both of those, right? You don't want to just say yes to everything you're ever asked and be conformist, but you don't want to get so caught in the like, I'm a special snowflake. I think that's actually what I love about open education, because it's not just remove people from any kind of classroom environment where someone's telling them what to do entirely, nor is it keep people where that's the only environment they're ever in. It's like, let's expand the number of diverse environments people are in. Let them be in a place where they're the oldest, most knowledgeable person in the room, and other times where they're the youngest, least knowledgeable person in the room. Let them be in places where have all kinds of different mixes of these environments, so you can understand how to navigate all of those situations and see that the world presents you with lots of different situations and environments where you need to put on different hats. Sometimes you need to stand up for yourself and defend who you are. Other times you need to say, yeah, I'll take out the trash.
Interesting. I have a question to follow this up. So it seems like these social things, right? Like the fact that you're going to sometimes just be obedient and do the job that is in front of you. And that's actually a good thing. And sometimes that's not the case. It seems like these social things you learn from exposure. Like you learn it from exposure when you're in a young classroom. You learn it from exposure when you are say, let's say you're a teen, you've never experienced this before, but your manager is saying, no, I don't actually care about your joy. Just go take out the trash. And like, you actually do learn it from there. And that's a pivotal learning moment. Do you think, either of you, that there's a better time to expose to different types of social things? Like, I know that, Isaac, you said diversity. Do you think it's important to have it at all points, or do you think it's important to have it at different points more and like in higher potency?
I mean, I think like if we just look at the way that the world lays itself out for us, sort of the structure of human experience, it's full of a diverse range of these types of relationships from day one. Like, humans have all these different kinds of relationships. Some where you are the authority or the responsible party, like when you have a child, they literally can't do anything and you have to do everything. Others where you're peers, you have siblings or friends on the same level as you. Others where someone else is in a position where you need to kind of follow their lead and let them lead, and you are subordinate to them, and everything in between. You have all this diversity. And so, like, this is one of the critiques I have of the kind of totally free range parenting, free range education thing, is that you create this idea where you are only ever the one in charge of everything. And that's not how the world is. There's lots of environments where that's not the case. You walk into a grocery store, you have implicitly agreed to the rules of whoever owns that grocery store. And you can't just go. And so, like, a kid saying to your kid, hey, when it comes to what you want to learn today, maybe I'm going to give you a whole bunch of freedom and say, do it. You can decide. You live in my house, your room has to be cleaned. And both of those can be true. You can have certain things that are just non-negotiable. Yeah, you clean your room. This is part of living in a house with other people. We can't have things trashed. Or if you make a mess in the bathroom, maybe that's an even better example because it's a more common area. You make a mess in the bathroom, you clean it up. You made the mess, you clean up the mess. Non-negotiable. But then when it comes to, hey, should I, what kind of science curriculum should we have today? What do you want to do? Should we go outside and look at rocks? You don't need to go one way or the other. You don't need to control every facet of a kid's education and life, nor do you need to say, okay, I just have to let them choose everything. Real life presents us with all of these different mixtures and combinations. TK, I'm curious your take on that.
Listen, I know that she is the asker of the question, but I think sometimes the asker has some amazing insights themselves. And I've been watching Ella take all these notes, which already changes my game. I'm going to start taking notes when I do podcasts, but I got to hear what's on some of those notes, man.
I honestly don't know. I mean, like, it would make sense to me that it's important to expose kids to a range of rules, right? Like, here is when, like what Isaac said, here is when you play your own game. Here is when you choose, and here is when somebody else chooses for you and you conform. And like, that is okay. But I do think, like, exposing kids to so many, right? Like, the games that, I mean, you gave the example of young girls, and like, I was privy to that. The games that young girls play whenever they are young are not always great to be exposed to. Like, sometimes they are really not great, actually. If I would recommend that kids be exposed to that, like, when you go into school, is the assumption that you're putting your kid into a situation where he's going to have to figure it out, or she's going to have to figure it out?
I see what you're saying. You're getting at a question that's more like, are there things that you just want to shelter your kids from altogether?
Yeah, both and. Like, I think part one of the question is what you said initially, and then part two is like, okay, sometimes people choose to homeschool because they don't want their kids to be exposed to certain things. Are there valid things that you actually should keep your kids unexposed from in order to keep them, like, creative and free in a sense?
100%. I mean, think about if you have an environment where your kid's going and getting beat up every day, saying, well, it's good for you to learn what it's like to be in environments where you get beat up every day. Like, yeah, it's probably not the best way to look at it, right? Like, there are things where you just say, that's not a good environment for you, right? Like, I got to get you out of there. I don't want you exposed to that. I don't want you to normalize being a victim, and to just grow into that and considering that something that's normal. So I completely agree. And even just the behavioral type stuff. Like, if there is a social circle where all the kids do is gossip and backstab and there's just low character, you don't want that to seem normal to your kids. So it's okay. Pull them out of that, right? But I think the concept in general of, it's a really tough challenge. You don't want to create this illusion that you create this perfect manufactured bubble where your kids only ever experience some utopian version of just getting to follow their bliss or whatever. Because life has, like scarcity exists. Like reality is not always perfect. That's okay to recognize that. You don't want to fall back on the, yeah, well, life's tough. You might as well learn it now. I got beat up when I was a kid and I turned out okay. It doesn't mean that that's the best thing to do, right? Just because the world is imperfect doesn't mean you should assume that every imperfection or bad thing is character building for your kid. TK, I would love to hear your take too on that balance, because that's always a tough, like, to what extent do you say, well, the world's tough, just might as well experience it? And to what extent do you shelter your kids from that?
Sure. I agree with what you said in your first take, where you talked about how all of these realities are experienced in the early stages of life. What changes is not a matter of the diversity, but rather a matter of the intensity. So the life is tough, you better start dealing with it now kind of attitude isn't even one that you have to have, because it's going to happen, right? You're going to have one sibling picks on another, or someone's not going to get what they want and it seems very unfair. Someone's going to have to accommodate the presence of another person. Someone's going to have to do something that they don't enjoy. Nature has designed it to be the case that we will all experience varying degrees of suffering at every stage of life. And you actually have to go out of your way as a parent to insulate your child from those things. And so usually the hardest part of parenting isn't, how can I make sure my child learns from suffering? The hard part is how can I put a check on my natural tendency to intervene to protect them from all the suffering that I can see that they don't know they're walking towards? When should I get out of the way and let them follow through on what it is they're trying to do? So those experiences are packed into every stage of life, and it's a matter of the intensity increasing as we go on. But I think as parents, it's important that we do think critically about our own value system and be honest with ourselves about things that we don't want our children being exposed to, even though we know at some point in life they will have the power to expose themselves to those things. And our goal is to equip them with the tools to be able to think critically and creatively about the inevitable realities before they get there. So there's some very bad, evil things going on in this world. And I don't have to be the one to expose children to that at age 6. But what I can expose them to at age 6 is a set of tools so that as they grow older, as they mature, and as they begin to confront these things that I can't protect them from, they know how to process their emotions. They know how to make sense of their experiences. They know how to leverage their relationships for perspective and support. I can't prepare my child for every uncertainty, but I can prepare them for the social and intellectual dimensions of problem solving that are an aspect of every experience.
So you just made an interesting pivot into an adjacent but slightly different topic that I think is a perfect one to chat on for our last 10, 15 minutes here. Children, I think kids naturally have a more enchanted view of the world, which is wonderful and magical. To what extent do you allow them to be disenchanted or help them be disenchanted? And I mean, in terms of teaching and subject matter exposure. Let's take a historical example. It's like, hey, you're learning about countries and geography and history, and you're 6 years old. Now let's talk about the Holocausts and how some government murdered millions of people. Like, that's a really like innocence shattering thing. You need your kids to learn about the way that the world is sometimes horrible and hideous. To what extent do you protect them from things when they're not ready? I mean, it's like this even with, whatever, you're watching movies and they have a lot of violence in them or something. How much do you let them be exposed to at what age? I know nobody has a single answer for this, but I'm curious from both of your perspectives, how do you approach things like that, especially when it comes to teaching something like history? Like, hey, there's a tendency to go one of two ways, to be overly romantic. Let's take American history. America is glorious, founded on these wonderful ideas, and it's just this wonderful story of, the American dream, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's like the really cynical revisionist, like, America is just founded by a bunch of slave owners and it's always been hypocritical. And there's a civil war where 600,000 people died. You feel very often like people try to push you into one of those camps, and you try to like make your kids be like, this is the land of hypocrisy, or this is the most glorious land ever. Even just when it comes to history, I don't know, like, how do you handle that, exposing your kids to the bitter realities of the world versus protecting them from them?
I have a follow-up, actually.
I have an answer, Ella. No more questions.
Well, do you shield yourself from certain things.
Absolutely.
Mostly shield yourself from too many conversations with me.
I have to put constraints on how much I talk with Isaac.
True
And-
story. TK did shield himself many, many years ago when I was rooting for the Detroit Pistons and he was rooting for the Los Angeles Lakers and they were playing in the NBA Finals. We had a watch party at my house. Everyone sat upstairs and watched it on the normal size TV. Because TK was rooting for the Lakers and I was rooting for the Pistons, he had to go down in the basement and watch it on a tiny TV. He had to shield himself from my trash talk because he knew it would like poison him too much. Sometimes you got to protect yourself from the reality of Pistons fans, you know?
So back to your question, Ella.
I thought that was a very pertinent anecdote.
So last year, I actually chose to step away from social media for the entire year. And then I came back for 2 days and just got back off again for Lent. So I've been on for about a couple of days. Before I did that, I was posting on social media every day, many times, multiple times a day. And I was consuming a lot of content there. And so I deliberately shielded myself from that because I had some intentions that I wanted to pursue. I wanted to spend much more time reflecting. I wanted to spend much more time reading more substantial works like books that are longer than 500 pages, written long before I was born. And I knew that was going to take a serious effort from me. And I had to be honest with myself that I would often pick up the phone. And although I had the intention of just looking at one thing that was sent to me or just checking the notifications for 5 minutes, I would find myself scrolling and just watching other entertaining things that were related to that. And then it's an hour later or it's 2 hours later, and I lost that time. So I had to shelter my exposure so that I could hit the reset button, re-engage some discipline and focus, and also just as an experiment in personal development, see what happens to my mindset when I unplug for a little bit. So that would just be one example, but I think any kind of progress in life requires a radical self-honesty about our weaknesses, about the levels of exposure that we don't respond so healthfully towards, and then mitigating that. So for many people, that's things like the news, which Isaac and I have had many conversations about, and I've never struggled with overexposing myself to that. If I have a struggle with it at all, and I don't think I do, it's underexposure. But I know many people who feel obliged to just expose themselves to everything because it conforms to a standard notion of being informed. But then when they look within, they say, I don't like what this is doing to me. I'm angry all the time. I'm scared all the time. I'm sad all the time. And so sometimes it's a process of discovery. We don't know what the standards are ahead of time. Every individual is different. Some people can handle things that others don't handle as well. And so with ourselves and with our children, we have to sort of experiment and explore it and give ourselves the grace as teachers, as mentors and parents of saying, hey, I'm not going to get it all right on the first try. I am also learning alongside my students, alongside my children about what works best for me and them. So that's my answer to your question.
That was super helpful because I was thinking through this a little bit. And I mean, my answer would be similarly. I do shield myself from certain things that are not helpful. And I think what you value is a really good temperature check on what you should shield yourself from. Like, where are you going? What is helping you? What is not helping you? I do think, though, like Isaac, you were saying, that there are some things that are just so necessary for people to understand. Like, you can't live your life without understanding that the world is bad sometimes. You know, like, you just can't. Some people probably have, and it's okay. But like, it's interesting because in a traditional school, teachers have an age where they say, okay, you're about ready to learn this. I think the beauty of parent-led learning is that a parent knows the development of a child more than an age, right? It's not as simple as an age. So, I mean, I remember learning about the Holocaust for the first time, and like some of the boys in my grade were just like laughing the whole time because like they weren't ready for it. And I think that's where it comes to the parent, where it's like, okay, what information is necessary? So, like, as an adult, it is very useful for me to understand as much as possible in most landscape regards. What is the world I'm operating in? What is the world that I'm making decisions in? What information is going to help me make better decisions? Understanding that if you follow a leader carelessly, you can lead yourself and a country into turmoil. Like, that's really important because as adults, we have responsibilities to not allow that to happen. But I do think that's where it comes back to the parent. And it's like, maybe you just expose kids to a little bit first, and maybe you don't say too much. And then maybe you go a little bit deeper. And like, as a parent, doing a temp check as to, okay, where is my kid? Are they interested? Are they asking questions? Do I think they are emotionally and mentally ready to handle this? And have I given them the tools in order to know what to do so afterwards? So like if they are scared, for example, or if they are frustrated, for example, do they have the tools to know what happens next? And that I can let them into the world with this new knowledge and it's not going to be something detrimental to them.
So I think about two things. Both are alliterative because I love alliteration. Principles before particulars and pacing before pushing. So if your kid is going to run into the particulars of something like the Holocaust or the Civil War or the slave trade, if they run into that just cold and it's like, here's this thing that happened in the world that is instinctively like terrible and repulsive and tragic, and they don't know where to put that or what to do with it, then they have to ask all these questions that force you to, like, after being exposed to this particular evil, form a worldview that helps explain how that could happen. Why, what does it mean? What do I learn from it? But if they come into that with principles already that are more like things that are always true and enduring, then they have a way to integrate those particulars. And she would say things like, you know, about one of the girls was like, "Oh, our kitten died and it was injured and we had to go take it to the vet and put it down. It was all tragic." And she was like, "Oh, y'all, animals die all the time. My grandma, she told me that sometimes you just gotta take it out back and shoot it. She don't sugarcoat nothing." Like, and I just thought about, like, if you live in a rural area or you're interested in nature as a young kid, kids will watch nature documentaries or whatever, and you're like this beautiful gazelle running around, and then a cheetah comes and eats it and kills it. There is something in there where you're like, the world has things that seem tragic, or even like an accident that, like, an animal falls off a cliff or something, right? Or like you see a wildfire. You see these things that are little hints at things that are realities in the world, and you start to build up. Or like somebody who, does something wrong in a much smaller context, not something horrible like the Holocaust, and you start to like see and develop an understanding of various principles about things that are true of the world. It's imperfect. Tragedy happens. Sometimes people do things that are really bad. Sometimes there are unintended consequences. Sometimes then when you've built up this understanding of principles, starting, I think, with nature, which is the simplest, and then expanding to sort of human nature in smaller group settings and family settings, then you are introduced to the particulars of something horrible in history. You have a set of principles by which to understand them a little bit more easily and integrate and be like, this is just the logical extension of some of these principles that I've observed elsewhere. And on the second one, pacing before pushing, there's a tendency to feel like you got to be tracked on these grade or age-based things, as you mentioned, Ella, that like, now it's time that we all read To Kill a Mockingbird. I think pacing is like figuring out what is the right pace. Just like with music, you don't just play every song at the same number of beats per minute, right? Like every song has to have its own pace for it to be beautiful, for it to make sense. And I think with kids, it's similar. I remember meeting this couple, and my wife and I, our kids were very young, and they had been really successful, made a lot of money, and then moved out of the city into a country. And I said, "Why did you do that?" And he said, "Because we wanted our kids to grow up slowly." That was really important to us. And that always stuck with me. Like, your kids will grow up at whatever pace they grow up on if you put them in an environment that doesn't artificially push them. And they'll grow at different paces. But allowing people to kind of grow into, so they're introduced to these principles through exposure to the world, the natural world, life, and they're kind of following their pace. And then they'll start to have interest. They'll bump into things about history. Like I did at some age, I got super interested in the Civil War. And then I just pursued on my own all of this reading and learning and understanding and trying to understand, like, where did the slave trade come from? What was going on here? Letting that happen based on their own pace instead of just deciding, now you need to learn this, I think is not that you can't sometimes push, not that you can't sometimes introduce these particulars, but like start with principles, start with pacing before particulars and before pushing.
This reminds me of a significant moment in my life that I told you about, and I'm thankful that my parents never took it away from me too early. It was the moment where I see Hulk Hogan pick up Andre the Giant and body slam him. It's like, in that moment, I knew anything was possible, right? In that moment, it's like, I know whatever it is I want to do in life, I can do it. And what if someone steps in and says, you do know that that's all choreographed, right? And for some kid, that's going to be the reality they have to face too. But there is something to be said about the fact that we have time. We have time to teach all the various lessons. And if we think about it in terms of gradations of nuance, it allows us to be able to do this without a sense of inconsistency, because the very nature of learning is such that we always start from some oversimplified place, and then we add nuance in order to reflect reality more accurately. So if we're talking about math, we have to begin with the acknowledgement that the square root of 4 is more nuanced than just 4. -4 is more nuanced than just 4. 4.3 is more nuanced than just 4. And you don't start teaching kids how to count by saying 1, 1.1, 1.2, 1.3. Oh, I guess we have an issue with Zeno's paradox, guys. So let's talk about that, right? Because we're never going to get to 2. You pretend as if Zeno's paradox doesn't exist. You pretend as if 1.2 isn't even a thing. And you say, let's just go with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we're going to pretend like there are only 10 numbers. 10. Why? Because we can get to every other number by what we do with those. So let's ignore everything else and just focus on that. It's giving you the foundation that's going to help you understand the square root of 4. It's going to help you understand -10. It's going to help you figure out how to get to 111 on your own. And then we get to Zeno's paradox. And sometimes you'll have children who come to you and say, hey, tell me about the square root of 4. And you can tell by the way they're asking that they're ready for it. And you just go straight to that. You say, oh, this wasn't part of my curriculum, but let's skip past it and go straight there. And then other kids will be like, well, I'm stressed about the square root of 4. And the right response is to say, ignore that. Ignore that. Let's just focus on 4 and the role that that has. And so when we talk about things like, exposure to great wars in our history, the Holocaust is a lot more nuanced than just death. And if we haven't had any conversations about that, because that's a pretty mind-blowing thing to encounter for the first time. Are we even ready for a conversation about that? But also death is a little more nuanced than something like dishonesty. Someone knows the truth. They have a reason for suppressing the truth because it allows them to experience a greater amount of convenience. Let's talk about that and why we sometimes as human beings do things like that. And if we understand dishonesty and deception and things like fear at a lower level, then that can help us understand things like harm and destruction. And that can help us work our way up to that so that, like you said, we have some principles upon which we can ground the particulars. So I think like Wicked would be a great example of this, right? We start all stories in a simple way for children. We say, here's the good guy, here's the bad guy. And that's so helpful because it's really easy, right? There's just the good guy who does it all right. There's a bad guy who does it all. You got that? Okay, now let me add something. The bad guy actually once was a good guy. What? Yeah, the bad guy actually started off as a good guy. But then someone did something that was really mean to him, unfair to him, and he had to make a choice. Am I going to do the right thing about it? Or am I going to do this about it? And sometimes we can start off being the good guy, but then we have challenges and we can make the wrong choice. And then we become a little bit of both. We're kind of a good guy in some ways, but we're a bad guy in other ways. And you work your way towards that complexity. And sometimes the universe doesn't give you a choice. Sometimes life says, hey, I'm going to throw a death in the family. I'm going to throw a tragedy here. I'm going to expose your children to something that you weren't ready to talk about. And now you're forced as a parent to have a conversation about something early on. But when you have a choice, I think it's a good rule to follow that learning begins with the oversimplified presentation, coupled with the intention to add nuance as they demonstrate a readiness for it.
This has been super fun. We started with the weird question. Will your kid be weird? Maybe if you want them to be. If you don't want them to be, they don't have to be. It's not that big a deal. You don't need to worry so much about it. You can have an open education and have a kid that is successful in all the ways that matter to you. Then we ranged all over the place. Guys, this was a ton of fun. I appreciate it. Even though I opened up calling you both weird, you stuck with me and decided not to return any insults. So TK, Ella, appreciate it.